I'm Glenn Campbell. I call myself a demographic philosopher. I'm looking at life and trying to predict the future through the lens of demography, or the study of human populations. And today I want to answer the question, why is a falling population a bad thing? Now, we can reasonably argue that the Earth is overpopulated right now, and that populations have exploded in recent decades. Back in 1974, there were only 4 billion people on the planet, and within the next 5 years, there will be 8 billion people on the planet, which is roughly doubling the human population in about 50 years. And you can reasonably argue that this is too damn many people, and that all of these people are having an impact on the environment. They're spewing out greenhouse gases. They're crowding out other species. They're damaging the environment that they ultimately have to live in. So wouldn't it be better if we could just go back to 4 billion people? And it's easy to agree in principle that 4 billion is probably healthier all around. The problem is how to get there without causing more damage to the world than the benefit you're getting from reducing the population. And this isn't just an academic exercise, because population around the world is in fact peaking. We'll soon have 8 billion people, and after that we'll probably have 9 billion people on the planet. But at that point, the population will crest. At some point, we will get to a maximum population of something around 9 or 10 billion. That's because birth rates are falling everywhere in the world, especially in the developed world. Throughout Europe and North America and Asia, there aren't enough babies being born today to refresh the population. Every woman on average has to have about 2.1 babies each to sustain the population, because men can't have babies. And in most of the countries in the world, women are producing far less than that. In South Korea, for example, and in Singapore, women are producing only about 1 baby per woman, which means that there are half of as many children in each generation as there were in the previous generation. And that means ultimately that every generation is going to fall by 50%. And that's a huge change from the environment that I knew in the 1970s. In the 1970s, when I was growing up, everyone was concerned about a population explosion. It was predicted in the 1970s that we would have 16 billion people on the planet by now, and that just didn't turn out. It turns out that the greater risk to us is a population implosion, where we just can't maintain enough people to sustain ourselves. So sooner or later, we are going to get back to that 4 billion level. And you would think that that's good for the world, good for the environment at least, because everyone will have more space. There will be less impact on nature. It will be good for everyone, you would think, but that's not necessarily the case. It could be that the world with 4 billion people could be even worse for the environment than a world with 8 billion people. So what are the mechanisms that make population loss a bad thing? And first of all is the distortion of the age ratio. If your society has only 1 baby per couple, then it means that you have a ton of old people, that proportionally old people dominate society. So you may have a whole lot of retired people compared to, say, the workforce that are supporting the retired people. Now, you can always push up the retirement age, but what you can't push up is the health effects of getting old. As people age, they get sicker. They have more health issues because age is a major risk factor for all kinds of diseases. And typically, people spend the last 10 or 15 years of their lives concerned mainly about health issues and just being able to stay alive. In the last few years of life, people are very weak. You can try to push up the retirement age, but for the most part, they can't work. They don't have the physical strength to work. And so these people are a drain on society. They are called dependents on society. There's two kinds of dependence. There are children who aren't producing any economic output, and there are the very old people who aren't producing economic output. Dependents are only a drain on society. And if we stop having babies, then you have a whole lot of these dependents on the high end, on the old end of the scale, and you don't have enough active workers producing taxes and paying into pension funds to support those older people, and that means a whole lot of misery for the older people. They're going to die alone, and they're going to die impoverished and without medical care because there aren't enough of the people in the younger cohort to support them. Younger people are also the engine of innovation in any society. Young people are the people who change things and build things and start new businesses and come up with solutions to things. And whereas old people are just trying to stay alive, and they are not the innovators, they are not the change makers, and they just want things to stay the same or to go back to the way things used to be. And if you have a whole lot of old voters, well, you have a very distorted electorate. Think of all the populist movements of recent years, like the election of Donald Trump. Donald Trump was not elected by young people. He was elected by the old people who want to go back to making America great again, who want to go back to some idealized version of their country. This is happening all over the world. Populist leaders are being elected by the old people, and because there are so damn many old people in the world, the old people tend to win elections. So even though the world belongs to the young, when you have too many old people, you have them distorting the electorate and distorting democracy in their favor. There are really only a couple of things that old people want from democracy. They want to protect their entitlements, their Social Security payments, and whatever benefits they get from the government, and they want to go back to the good old days when they think things were better. So age distortion is a big problem when any population falls. You also have the problem that economies are addicted to growth, that economies were developed in the last quarter of the 20th century and into the 21st century on the assumption of perpetual growth. If you buy a stock today, let's say in Google or Amazon, you're buying the assumption that these companies are going to continue to grow at the same pace that they have grown in the past. And this growth cannot continue if, in fact, the underlying population doesn't grow. And the whole economy is like that. It has a built-in bias toward growth, which has been fine for the economy for the past 40 years or so, but it can't be sustained. So the growth bias of the economy is represented in debt. All sorts of entities, and from individuals to governments to corporate entities, have taken on a lot of debt in recent years, which seems to make sense only if growth continues. If growth doesn't continue, then all that debt becomes unsustainable. Think of government debt and think of how much debt the U.S. government has chalked up over the past few years. Right now, the debt of the U.S. government is roughly 100% of GDP. In other words, government debt is roughly 100% of the total annual economic output of the country, which is unpayable and unsustainable unless the economy continues to grow at an unusually high pace. In that case, the debt might actually be payable. If the economy reverses and starts to shrink because the number of consumers is shrinking, then the government debt becomes unsustainable, and sooner or later the government has to default on that debt. It has to stop paying on that debt, and that's going to have devastating effects on the government and the ability of the government even to continue to exist. So the problem of falling populations is that it ultimately leads to a shrinking economy and a hard reckoning when the assumptions of the economy have to crash, when the debts and the stock market prices of things have to crash. And we have to get used to a sort of permanent economic decline where every year, instead of the economy growing, the economy gets smaller and smaller and smaller. This may actually lead to unemployment because even though there are fewer workers, there's also less economic activity. In a shrinking society, you don't have to build things anymore. You don't have to build new housing when the population is falling. You don't have to build new roads. So the construction industry has to collapse in a collapsing economy, and that means less workers for the construction industry. So even though you have a shortage of workers, what seems to be a shortage of workers, in a shrinking economy, you could actually end up with greater unemployment. In a shrinking community, you also lose a certain economy of scale. For example, let's say you have a community of 50,000 people, and that community falls to 25,000 people, and you had a hospital in this community. Well, with a smaller population, maybe you can't support that hospital anymore, so the hospital has to close. With something like a hospital or a transit system or a supermarket, you need a certain population to maintain the business. And if the population falls below a certain point, then those businesses have to close. The hospital has to close. The supermarket has to close if population falls below a certain level. And this is happening in rural communities all over the world. Small cities, let's say in Texas or in Bulgaria or in Japan, if the population of the city falls by, let's say, a half, then a lot of municipal services aren't supportable anymore. You don't have a hospital or a supermarket anymore. And this actually encourages more people to leave this small town and run away to the city. And this is resulting in a sort of rural drain, a rush to the cities. For example, in Japan, Japan's population is falling every year by something like 500,000 people. But Greater Tokyo is still the same size. Tokyo hasn't fallen in population. And the capital cities of Eastern Europe, like Budapest and Sofia, they're not falling in population, even though their respective countries are. And that's because everyone is running away from the rural areas to the city because the rural areas are dying. And so what this is doing is reducing the world to big cities. People are becoming more and more urbanized. As population falls, people are becoming more urbanized. The big cities are continuing to thrive as the small cities wane and collapse. And the trouble with cities is they are not conducive to children. When people move to Tokyo, they have fewer children than they would have out in the countryside because children in Tokyo are far more expensive than they are in the countryside, more expensive to raise. So you're continuing to have falling birth rates as people urbanize. They're having fewer babies, and fewer babies mean even faster decline. So all of this adds up to a really bad economic situation. It adds up also to a really bad political situation. Think of all the populist movements in recent years, like the election of Donald Trump, the election of various strongman leaders like Erdogan in Turkey, and dictators and want-to-be dictators around the world that were elected by the people. The trouble is they're elected by the old people. The old people, because the age is distorted now toward the old, in places like America, the old people can elect who they want to elect. Donald Trump was not elected by young people. He was elected by the baby boomers, the old people who see their lives deteriorating. They think that the government has made promises to them that aren't being met, and they want to go back to the old days. So they elect any charlatan leader who will promise to make America great again, to bring back the old days. So one of the first things that populist leaders do is they get rid of environmental regulations. Donald Trump has announced his desire to burn more coal. So what we have with populist movements is actually a weakening of environmental regulations, which means actually a falling population could be worse for the environment than a growing population was. Maybe we get down to 4 billion people on the planet, but if governments have deteriorated, governments have collapsed, and environmental programs have been canceled, then we're burning more coal, we're cutting down more forests, and things really aren't any better for the natural world than they were when we had 8 billion people. You also have the problem that once you get to 4 billion people, which I'm confident will happen, how do you stop? How do you keep from falling to 2 billion people and 1 billion people? Once people get into the mode of not having babies, and once people look around and see how bad their society is and decide that really isn't a good idea to have a baby, how do you convince them again to have more babies? And that is a real challenge. The real challenge is once you get down to your optimal level, the level that you feel that the human population will be at, how do you encourage people to have babies again so humanity doesn't vanish altogether? Now, some people think that humanity should vanish, that the humanity should just go away so the planet can thrive again. I'm not one of these people. I believe that there is some value in humanity. But it's a real challenge to reach some kind of steady state where you have the right balance of humans and other creatures and where your society still continues to work. It's relatively easy to get a society to work when everything is growing. It's much more challenging to maintain a society when population is shrinking because you have this great age distortion, you have a shrinking economy, you have deteriorating social conditions. All of this is the great challenge of the next century. How do we shift from a growing population to a shrinking population and still make everything work?